Espen Barth Eide, please.
Thank you for inviting me to Leankollen again, and it's a fascinating subject. Congratulations to the committee for putting that so high on the agenda. I get a little bit of déjà vu because when we were in government many years ago, we started to raise this issue, saying that shouldn't we start analyzing how the world is changing in fundamental ways? The rise of China becoming the factor that changes more or less everything. And at the Ministry of Defense in 2008, we started more systematic work on understanding the changing geopolitics around us, understanding how this changed America's relation to China, by implication also us, and how Asia increasingly became the gravity. So East Asia and Southeast Asia was becoming the center of gravity for international security. So if you think about Checkpoint Charlie in the middle of Berlin, just where East and West met, as the epicenter of security policy in the second half of the last century, you could say that maybe that's the Senkaku Island now or somewhere around there. That's really where the world is being played out. And we are now, in a sense, in the periphery, where we used to be close to the center of what is most important. That does not mean that we should put all our efforts on dealing with Asia, in no way. But it means that we need to understand the predominance of this theme for all the key players. And that's what Øystein does so well in explaining, and I fundamentally agree with his theoretical approach to this, and also with the policy advice of what to think about. And it's not a new idea, we've had it for a while. When we started talking about this in NATO, in the final years of the last decade, so 2008 to 2010, there was very little response. NATO was predominantly preoccupied with two things. The number one was Afghanistan and neighborhood, asymmetric operations in faraway places, important enough but rather unrelated to this big power game, or Russia, which was slowly growing in attention, particularly among the new member states, but this picture was much less focused. Now it's the name of the game. If you go to Washington, I think others have mentioned it, but I do go to Washington quite often, and fundamentally in Washington they speak about two themes. Theme number one is Trump, and then that takes 60% of the time, and whatever is left is about China, and fundamentally with a skeptical approach. The sort of the right and the left have slightly different entry points, but they both have a worry about the rise of China, and we need, as allies of the US, to understand that. Not that we have to agree with it, I think we shouldn't, but we need to understand how important that is in US discourse. They hardly speak about anything else, frankly, than those two themes. And if they think we talk about small movements in Europe, we're wrong. They don't. I mean, there's of course an office in Pentagon, a couple of people at CSIS, and some others who know. So you find 10 people interested, but it's not the predominant theme, right? So this is something we really need to understand, and we need to understand what it means to us. I agree that we will not have a new Cold War. It doesn't look like the Cold War. It's not the same type of ideological competition, but it might still lead to a new division of the world into two economies with much less interaction. Globalization might be at the end of globalization. That means that, and for Norway, who has really thrived more than most on a genuine globalized economy, which we only had for 30 years. We didn't have it before the end of the Cold War and China's entry into the WTO and so on. That world is changing, and it affects everything, not only security policy, but a lot of economy, a lot of trade. I know the shipbuilders and the ship owners care about this, because who's going to transport where? Will transport routes, what will happen? All these things are deeply related to all this. It also means, and again, it has been said, it means that the 21st century is about naval competition. That means Navy, Air Force, space, cyber, more than land competition. We shouldn't sort of close the army down, but we came out of a century with the predominance on land. Now it's very much on the Navy, and we need to understand that as well, because that's where the least likely thing of, even if you talk about war, It's not about China invading the territory of the US or US invading the territory of China. It would be a conflict about spheres of influence and who dominates the sailing routes and the countries in the neighborhood of China. And here China has an advantage that we tend to forget. You don't need to be on pair if you fight at home. You don't need to be on pair because it's so much cheaper, so much easier to take the fight close to your own shores, because there's much less logistics involved and much more emphasis on the fighting. It's very heavy to be sort of the faraway country trying to protect power. So China has no ambition, in my view, of becoming number one. They're very happy being what we call in Norway a god nummer to, a good number two, meaning somebody who has the asymmetric capability to deny what America wants in its neighborhood and then leave the rest of the world to Americans in a military sense. We will, and I'll come to a conclusion, we will increasingly be asked to make tough decisions. And the first one is, what kind of 5G system will we use? But we need to understand that we have to draw a line between those worries which are warranted about, for instance, critical infrastructure, and those which are more driven by an American fear of losing technological advantage, which is frankly not our problem. Right? I mean, so we have to distinguish between those two because they will sound similar. But we need to find out, where do we agree? With whom do we ally in standing up for human rights? That's probably on the Western side. But with whom do we work? We and the Europeans work on climate change, which for many is an equally important topic. Maybe China, not the US. Right now, that might actually be where we will find more partnerships. So we grew up in a world where all good things came in a package and was broadly called the West. That world's gone. We need to navigate in a much more complex world, and what Øystein and company tells us is crucially important to understand and to find out how we answer those questions on the 21st century. I don't know what they are, but it's definitely not perpetuating the answers of the 20th.
Thank you.